pray that as we go into this Thanksgiving holiday, that you would watch over those that are traveling, that you give them a safe journey. Father, we pray that you would continue to watch over all of us, that you would continue to bless us, bless this country, and bless our congregation. Father, we pray that you would be with those our number that are sick, those that are undergoing or are recovering from different treatments. Pray that you with each of them, that they would have a very quick recovery. Father, I pray that you would be with those of our number that are struggling in other ways. Help us to say and do things that would encourage them at this time. Lord, I pray that you go with us as we go throughout be with us as we go throughout this classroom period, that we would listen to your word, that we would learn from it, and use it to help us to become better Christians for you. We ask all these things in Christ's name.
I think you'll turn it up for you. Okay, we have been studying the book of Job now during this quarter. We've got 2 more nights of actual textual study. Then I want us to go to talk about some things like the scientific foreknowledge in the book of Job and some other things that are interesting there in the words that are used. I want us to talk about the evil itself, a little bit about theodicy, which we introduced as we started. But I want us to get the whole book studied first as far as the text. So that's what we'll be doing. And then those last few weeks we'll be doing the other. We are in chapter 38 tonight. This is the outline that we've had available on the table back here, a very basic outline from Nelson's Bible Dictionary. And we're to the part 3 here, the deliverance of Job. We've talked about what happened to him, just a few verses here, a couple of chapters. We've talked about the various conversations that went on, or basically monologues that other people listened to. It's just 3 friends, and then a 4th appeared. And then we're going to talk beginning tonight about the conclusion of the book and how he begins a conversation, or God begins a conversation with Job, which again is more one side listening to the other than it is an actual conversation. So here's the low up of it so we can see it a little bit better. We're going to attempt to cover chapter 38, verse 1 through 40 and verse 5 tonight, which is basically the first, it's right to call it a conversation. And I don't like the word controversy either, but it is maybe the first challenge that God gives to Job about what has happened to him and about the things that those friends have said and what he said in response to them. So we're going to cover those verses right there. Next week, Lord willing, we'll cover the second round. And we'll finish up with what happened in chapter 42 as the story comes to an end. And we see what happens to Job. We see what God says to his 4 friends as well. But now we want to look at this first conversation or challenge that Job has from God. Now, what was one thing that Job wanted to do throughout our whole textual study? Well, the whole process here, as Job responded to his friends in these back and forth, what's one thing that he constantly wanted to do? He wanted to know why, and he wanted some way to ask God why, right? He wanted a conversation with God. Not necessarily one-on-one. Maybe if somebody had been a go-between, that would have been okay. But he wanted God to tell him why has this happened. That God could help him because his 3 friends weren't helping him. And Elihu, when he got there, didn't help him. He couldn't reason it out because he knew it was not because of great sin in his life. So he's trying to figure out at various times, for instance, right here, chapter 31. Oh, that I had one to hear me. Here is my mark. Oh, that the Almighty would answer me, that my prosecutor had written a book. Surely I would carry it on my shoulder and bind it on me like a crown. I would declare to him the number of my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him. He's saying I would be totally, completely devoted to God, even though of what's happened to me, but really would like to have some details. I'd really like to know. I'd like for God to tell me. Well, Job either says this very plainly or at least hints at it a number of times in the things that he said in these previous chapters. And so we're going to get to the point where that happens. Job is going to be heard, and God is going to answer him from a whirlwind. And this is the most different kind of picture I could find. We don't know what it looked like. Was it a typical whirlwind like existed in that part of the world from time to time and not unusual to them, except that God spoke out of this one? Or was it something special? God may have created a special whirlwind like it had never been seen before. But at any rate, God spoke to him out of a whirlwind. And it's interesting to think what might have been on their minds as this started. We get the implication that Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and Elihu are still there probably. So what do you think when they saw that whirlwind approaching, however it came, what do you think might have been going through their minds? What did they think Job had done? Sinned, right? Do you think maybe they thought, well, Job's denied it too long, and now God's come after him. This is going to be the final thing. This is going to carry Job away. And maybe they were getting ready to head the other direction away from Job, thinking that this is the end. Job is probably, as he realizes, as he sees this coming to him, and perhaps as he realizes God's voice for the first time, maybe he's a little frightened, but maybe he's thinking, I'm finally going to get what I've been asking for. God is going to have a talk with me. The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, and he said, and that's what these next few chapters are all about. Now, did any of the friends think that this was ever going to happen? That God was going to answer Job in any way? I don't think they did. They thought Job was confused, or he was reluctant to admit his guilt, which had surely caused this because they believed in the theory of retribution. You do bad, you get punished. You do good, God takes care of you. And so they didn't think God would have a conversation with Job. In fact, back in chapter 5 and verse 1, Eliphaz says, is there anyone who will answer you? To which of the holy ones will you turn? In other words, who are you going to go to? Plus, they thought they were giving him all the answers that he needed. They thought they were providing Job with the correct answer. So why would God even want to talk to him? They didn't think this was going to happen. But this is exactly what happened. And Job is not going to get what he wants by way of an answer, but they're certainly not going to hear what they thought they were going to hear. Now, God uses whirlwinds and other amazing features of nature in a number of ways in the Old Testament, doesn't he? Where do you remember some whirlwinds coming in before? Famous events in the Old Testament in which a whirlwind was involved. Remember what happened to Elijah when he was hiding in the cave suffering from depression? God came by 3 times. What 3 forms did he come in? He came in an earthquake, he came in a whirlwind, and he came as fire. And he went by the cave where Elijah was inside. When it came time for Elijah to leave this earth and turn things over to Elisha, and the horses and chariots of fire came to get him before Elisha's eyes, how did he go up into heaven? By whirlwind. And lesser known, the prophet Ezekiel had a vision in Ezekiel chapter 1 in which God is said, or the vision was said to have been presented to him from the whirlwind, sort of like God talking to Job from the whirlwind. And of course, there are a lot of other things, situations in which there were smoke and thunderings and lightnings, in which God made himself known, made some kind of message known in the Old Testament. This is not unusual whatsoever, what he did with Job here. And so he speaks to Job, and who does he not speak to? Does he have a single word for Zophar and Bildad and Eliphaz? No, not there. He talks to Job, because Job has throughout simply been seeking answers. He's not profaned God's name. In spite of what he had been through, he came through in character better than these other men. So let's see the first thing that God says to him. Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. This is, we would say, perhaps stern language from God to Job, because Job has been asking these questions, assuming that there was an answer, God could give it to him, and maybe God should give it to him, and he'd be able to understand it and figure it out. Now, what does God say to him? Well, if you think you're ready for this answer, if you think you're ready for a conversation with me, if we're on the same conversational level here, you just get ready. I'm going to ask you some questions. And we know, because we've already read the book and heard the story, we know that after this is over, Job's going to realize, no, I didn't, this is really what was not what I was expecting, what God is saying to me. And perhaps I should not have spoken as I did, even though all that he spoke was not sinful. But God challenges Job because he thinks, the two of them can have a conversation he can understand. Now, giving away the ending here, but basically we all know the ending. Does Job ever get the answer that he thought he was seeking when the whole book of Job is over? Does he ever get it? He does not. Now, do you think perhaps that God gave us this book in the Old Testament, but today when we can read the story of Job, and sometimes we feel like circumstances are crushing us in, devastating us, and we're thinking, well, I wish God would talk to me right now and just explain to me why this is happening, what's going on. I know I can understand it. I know I could deal with it. God would just talk to me, explain this to me. We see God doesn't do that. God has enabled us to go back to the book of Job and see that that's the way it works sometimes. That we are not prepared for the answers because we are not God. Brother Darrell? Okay. Yeah, God didn't do this to Job. He allowed Satan to do it to Job. But it wasn't a matter of God doing this to him. Think of all the things that God did not say to Job. I'm kind of laying the groundwork for verses that we need to hurry up and get to. But what did God not say to Job throughout these discussions? Did he explain the situation where he was bragging in front of Satan about Job? No, doesn't mention a thing about Satan. Does he talk to him about, well, this life is pretty rough, but after all, there's eternity, there's life after death. Therefore, that's what you ought to cling to, Job. Does God tell you that? No, not in the verses that we have here. Does God explain to him and tell him, hey, this theory of retribution, that's a man-made idea. That's not so. Let me tell you how I really interact with people. Does God explain that? No, God doesn't explain that in these verses either. Does he condemn Job for seeking answers? No. He challenges Job to think about what he's doing and why he's doing it. Is he capable of doing it? But he doesn't condemn Job for seeking the answers to his questions. Just a lot of things that if we were writing a story that we think this might be the way God would interact with somebody in these circumstances, there are a lot of things we might write in that story that God would say, and God wouldn't say any of them. Because I think these are some of the things that we would want to put in there. But God didn't explain that. What God did was ask Job enough questions that Job said, I'm just going to let God be in charge of it. I'm going to leave it to God and understand that I'm not on the same discussion level that he is. And I'll just hold my peace. And that's what he does eventually. Okay, in the next few verses, God is going to fire at Job a series of questions. Different people have counted the number anywhere from 70 to 77, depending on how you break up the questions and how you consider them. But either way, it's a lot of questions that God asked Job. And they're questions that are not for Job to come up with the answer to. They're not questions that God is going to give him the answer to. They're questions that are going to cause Job to reflect and realize his inability to discuss these things with God in a way that will satisfy him and say, well, I know why this happened now. That's not going to happen. And he gives him, first of all, this first red, whatever this thing is right here, he gives him some questions about origins, about creation. Were you there when I did this? Where did this come from? How does this work? And then he moves on to a number of what we would call inanimate forces in nature, things that God has put into play. A lot of questions about them, but they're not living creatures. But then he goes on at the end to talk about what's called the animal kingdom there. I talk about animate objects and asking questions to Job about those. And Job is not able to answer these questions. So let's begin, and we may have to skip some verses because I want to be sure and get to the end of chapter 40 there before we close out our class tonight. But we'll do as much of this as we're able to do. He begins to ask him about creation. God says to Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. Who determined its measurement? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? To what were its foundations fastened? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. In other words, Job, give me an explanation of creation. If you want to have a conversation with me, if you think that I am obligated to explain to you the things that you're dealing with, you're questioning, answer these questions first. And of course, there are questions that Job cannot answer. Because God has revealed some of the answers to us, we could answer a little bit of these from Scripture, from Genesis, but we really couldn't answer to any great degree. These are questions that Job could not answer. Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst forth and issued from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band? When I fixed my limit for it and set bars and doors? When I said, this far you may come, but no further, and here your proud ways must stop? God's pictured in his power and the use of his power as saying to the ocean, okay, there's where you stop, right there. This is going to be land. This is going to be the ocean. You're going to stop right there. That's the way it's pictured. Simply an illustration of God's great power. And he's asking Job about these things. Were you there? Can you explain this to me? Could you help? Could you be a co-creator? Anything like that? Job was speechless. Have you commanded the morning since your days began and caused the dawn to know its place? In other words, are you in charge of daylight and dawn? The way the earth moves around in its orbit, its rotation, and the way the sun is. Have you been involved in that? That it might take hold of the ends of the earth and the wicked be shaken out of it. This is an interesting thing here about the wicked now. It takes on form like clay under a seal and stands out like a garment. From the wicked their light is withheld and the upraised arm is broken. When do the wicked do their wickedness? Okay, the darkness is what they would prefer. They do their wickedness in the darkness. And so God is poetically saying here, Job, have you been around to make sure that the dawn comes every morning, the sun comes up, so that the wicked don't have what they call light, which is actually darkness? See, the darkness lasts only a short time, but that's light to the wicked. That's when they operate. That's their blessed time. But God doesn't allow that to keep on going because, every 24 hours there's a cycle. Darkness goes and light comes, and that which the wicked would call light is withheld. That is the darkness. That's poetic language there. At first, that's not obvious. Why? What difference does it make withholding light? Well, the darkness was their light. And so God withholds that from them and keeps a check on the wicked. He says, Job, have you ever done that? Have you ever taken it this far and commanded these things so that this happened? So he's talking about creation. And now, beginning in verse 16, he starts talking about those inanimate objects or inanimate nature. Have you entered the springs of the sea? Have you walked in the search of the depths? Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the doors of the shadow of death? Have you comprehended the breadth of the earth? Tell me if you know all this. Again, all of these questions that Job was by no means prepared, had the power to answer to God. And somewhere along the way, Job gets the message, because even by the end of this first message from God, Job is going to choose silence. Where is the way to the dwelling of light? Where does light come from? You know, God's asking questions that even today the smartest minds in the world can't answer some of these things. And unfortunately, some of the so-called smartest minds in the world, when they do try to answer these things, they try to do so without the existence of God. Isn't that ironic? In darkness, where is its place, that you may take it to its territory, that you may know the paths to its home? Do you know it because you were born then, or because the number of your days is great? Remember what Job and his friends, some of the things that had come up there, and even with Elihu, the three older friends were allowed to speak first because it was assumed age, experience, wisdom. And Elihu sits there as long as he can stand it, and then he jumps in after the other three have talked. He says, now, I'm not as old as you guys, but let me tell you the truth here. Let me give you some wisdom about Job's situation. And of course, Job puts all of them in their place, and none of them were correct in their reasoning. But with age and experience, they thought comes wisdom. Well, God's making a point here. Job, are you as old as I am? Have you been around all this time? You know, is your number of days somewhere close to mine? That we're on the same conversational level here about this. Have you entered the treasury of the snow, or have you seen the treasury of hail, which I reserve for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? By what way is light diffused, or the east wind scattered over the earth? Who has divided a channel for the overflowing water, or a path for the thunderbolt, to cause it to rain on a land where there is no one, a wilderness in which there is no man? In other words, Job, what sort of control do you have over the weather? About as much as our weathermen today do, right? You know, there's still mysteries there. God controls all this. It's always controlled all this. And he says, Job, is this are you a meteorologist? Are you equipped? Are you experienced? Are you qualified in this? And of course, he was not. He couldn't answer these questions. To satisfy the desolate waste, to cause to spring forth the growth of tender grass, as the rain a father. Where's the rain come from, Job? Tell me about the hydrological cycle. You know, tell me how everything works. You know, if you're qualified. Or who has begotten the drops of dew? From whose womb comes the ice and the frost of the heaven? Who gives it birth? The waters harden like a stone, the surface of the deep is frozen. Job, can you explain these things? Can you explain even the basic things, such as all these great things that are part of our weather and our climate and our the changes around us that keep Earth flourishing the way it is? And then he would prompt Job, I suppose, to think about looking up into the sky. As far as we know, it's not night at this point. No indication that it would be. Still, you assume the daytime as they see the whirlwind. But Job perhaps picturing the night sky. We start talking about constellations and star formations. Can you bind the cluster of the Pleiades, or loose the belt of Orion? Or can you bring out Mazzaroth in its season? Mazzaroth, we're not quite sure of today because we don't use the same word there to identify any of our constellations, but it's believed that was probably a constellation too, and that was the name of it back then. We probably just know it by a different name today. Or can you guide the great bear with its cubs? So, no doubt Job, like most of us today, have looked up in the night sky and seen the various formations, the constellations, the arrangement of stars, and thought about the greatness of what God has created. And so God just asked Job, did you have anything to do with that? Did you move one star from here to there? Did you cause these arrangements? Do you know the ordinance of the heavens? Can you set their dominion over the earth? In other words, Job, are you an expert on the night sky and all the wonders that are there? And again, Job didn't speak, but he was thinking, no, these are things that only our Creator knows. I don't know. God continues asking questions. Can you lift up your voice to the clouds that an abundance of water may cover you? Can you send out lightnings that they may go and put to you, here we are? Who has wisdom in the mind? Who has given understanding to the heart? Who can number the clouds by wisdom? Or who can pour out the bottles of heaven when the dust hardens and clumps, the clods cling together? So the Lord just takes Job through what we might think of today as sort of a science course. Looking around the world, all these things that go on, and the scientists study and study and study, and as long as we're here, we'll still be learning things about what God did with the spoken word in 6 days. And Job understands that all this inanimate stuff he really, really doesn't understand. But then God moves on to animate nature. He moves on to creatures. Now, bear in mind that some of these creatures' names are matters of discussion. And depending on what translation you have, you may have one name for an animal, somebody else may have another one, because some of those Hebrew words, we aren't necessarily sure what creature they were. So don't let that concern you. But that doesn't change the point that God is talking to Job about all these animals, for instance, here. I think about 6 other animals and a couple of birds there. And he's going to ask him questions. We'll look at these in just a moment, about how they get food, the bearing of young, the taming of them. Why do some of them act kind of strange, especially the ostrich? How do they fly? How do all these things happen? All these questions that Job simply cannot ask. And even today, when you look at a list or a book of the animals of the world and you look through there, can any of us look and say, yeah, I know why that animal exists. Yeah, here's what God had in mind for that animal. Are there some animals that we just, why did God create that? What was he trying to tell us? What was he trying to provide for us? What was his purpose? What good does that animal do upon this earth? We don't know. Some of them, maybe they're there for comic relief for us, But we don't know why all those animals are there. We know that everything depends on everything else. We know that we aren't alone. Even out in the areas where there's just animals, they have their own little system, which, they play a part, and another plays a part, and they're all interdependent. But we don't know what every animal does. And so God's going to ask Job about some of the animals. Can you hunt the prey for the lion or satisfy the appetite of the young lions when they crouch in their dens or lurk in their lairs to lie in wait? Who provides food for the raven when its young ones cry to God and wonder about for lack of food? Job, can you see that all the creatures of the earth are taken care of like they need to be? That things go on as they should? Job can't, God does. Do you know the time when the wild mountain goats bear young, or can you mark when the deer gives birth? Can you number the months that they fulfill? Or do you know the time when they bear young, they bow down, they bring forth their young, they deliver their offspring? The young ones are healthy, they grow strong with grain, they depart and do not return to them. The cycle of life with animals. Job, can you understand all that? Do you have any control over that? Can you be involved in that in any way? Well, God's hand is over it all. Who set the wild donkey free? Who loosed the bonds of the onager? Whose home have I made the wilderness, and the barren land his dwelling? He scorns the tumult of the city. He does not heed the shouts of the driver. The range of the mountains the range of the mountains is his pasture, and he searches after every green thing. So there's one animal after another. And certainly God could have mentioned a long, long list here, and Job would have had the same response to it. I don't have a full understanding of them. Their ways are amazing. The wings of the ostrich wave proudly. Ostrich is portrayed as a proud bird. But Are her wings and pinions like the kindly storks? For she leaves her eggs on the ground and warms them in the dust. She forgets that a foot may crush them or that the wild beast may break them. In other words, the ostrich is seems like a strange animal to us. Some of the things that the bird does. And we think, the ostrich is not as intelligent a creature as some of them, but God takes care of her, and God has a purpose for her, the ostrich being there. She treats her young harshly, as though they were not hers. Not very good parents. Her labor is in vain without concern, because God deprived her of wisdom and did not endow her with understanding. When she lifts herself on high, she scorns the horse and its rider. So a proud animal, but doing some things we don't really understand that seem foolish to us. Job, can you explain that? Have you given the horse strength? Have you clothed his neck with thunder? Can you frighten him like a locust? His majestic snorting strikes terror. The horse was a fearsome animal back then. And the horse could be used in battle. And if you were on foot and a horse was coming at you with your enemy on it, you felt at a great disadvantage. It was because of the majestic nature of the animal and the power, the strength. It brought terror into the heart of the enemy. He paws in the valley and rejoices in his strength. He gallops into the clash of arms. He mocks at fear and is not frightened, nor does he turn back from the sword. So, says Job, did you ever create a creature like that? Tell me all about it. The quiver rattles against him, the glittering spear and javelin. He devours the distance with fierceness and rage. He gallops into battle. Nor does he come to a halt because the trumpet is sounded. At the blast of the trumpet, he says, aha! He smells the battle from afar, the thunder of captains and shouting. It's as if we've got a gung-ho horse here. He's ready for battle. He's not afraid of it. He is a strong and enthusiastic creature that God has made, as God pictures it here for Job. Does the hawk fly by your wisdom and spread its wings toward the south? A lot of things they didn't understand about flying back then, wasn't it? Most everything. It was a thing of wonder to see the birds as they would fly and glide around them. And Job didn't understand that any better than anybody else would have. Does the eagle mount up at your command and make its nest on high, or the rocks it dwells and resides, or on the crag of the rock in the stronghold? From there it spies out its prey, its eyes obscure from afar, its young ones suck up blood, and where the slain are, there it is. Of course, maybe that was the eagle, maybe that was a vulture or something like that. At any rate, it was an animal that definitely preyed on things it could see from very far away. Preyed on that which was already dead. So, we're coming to the end of chapter 39. Get ready for God's comments in 40, which are kind of short as far as what we're going to study tonight. But God has asked this series of questions. And in the next round, we'll talk about next week, hopefully, he's asked a bunch more. And all of them, Job has to remain silent to. Job begins to understand. Well, my friends weren't any help. I know they weren't right in the way they approached this problem. Their reasoning was not correct. But I was perhaps a little bit carried away with the idea of talking to God and getting the full answer about why this happened. Even though my friends didn't help me. And so we see as we move into chapter 40 what Job's response is going to be. The Lord concludes this section of questions with this statement. Moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? He who rebukes God, let him answer him. So we know that Job had not contended with God in a sinful way. He had not tried to correct God. He had not, as his friends had actually accused him of. They said, you have made accusations against God. You're saying God's not fair to you. And we've just explained to you several times why he is fair to you. You are talking badly about God. You're maybe blaspheming They didn't use that word. And Job says, no, I'm not. You don't understand. I'm not saying God's done wrong. I'm simply saying I don't understand how it is that God has done right in this situation. I don't understand. And so the Lord, I think we would say, mildly rebukes Job right here. When he says, shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Are you prepared to show me where I'm wrong? Are you prepared to show me where I've done something that's that I don't have the right to do as God, my nature? If you do, give me an answer. Jonathan, just a minute, and I'll get back to you. Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. Once I have spoken, but I will not answer. Yes, twice, but I will proceed no further. Job had made some statements, but now that God has asked him all of these questions and he realizes the greatness of God and the lowness of man, he says, I'm put my hand over my mouth. I've talked, I'm not going to talk anymore. Talked twice, I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm going to just listen now. And of course, Job does continue to listen to God. He was a wise and faithful man. Think about going through what he had been through, and yet able to say, I don't understand. And God has just told me, you're not going to understand. But still saying, you're a creator. I'm vile humanity. I'm going to be quiet. Which is one of the things that often gets us, a lot of us, in trouble, isn't it? When we don't put our hands over our mouth. I will lay my hand over my mouth. And that's often a good thing to do. Okay, Jonathan. He never charged God unjustly with his mouth. Yeah, I don't know that we know he never sinned, but as far as the discussion, I would take that statement to mean that as far as the situation that existed and the way that his friends were approaching it wrongly, and what he could have said and what he could have accused God of, he did not do that. He did not sin with his mouth in all that discussion. That's what I understand. I think he was trying to help Job understand that questioning wasn't the answer to his difficulties. Because I would still suggest that Job did not sin. So what God was telling him was, you've been good to this point, but here's one more thing you need to know. If you don't get the answer to this, you still need to love me and obey me. And of course, he never did get the answer. That's one of the things about the book of Job. Job never did get the answer. He never did get to read the events of chapter 1, where Satan says to God, you give me Job and I'll take care of him. Or you let me have his health and I'll take care of him. He'll curse you. Job never got to know that as far as we know. And yet he was told by God, there's some questions you won't know the answer to. You're not supposed to. Be faithful to me anyway. Good comment. Any more or anybody else? As long as it's not question and answer question. Randy's suggesting or asking the question, I guess, posing the question, could it be that God responded to Job with all these questions? Part of the reason being so that Satan, who would have known what was going on, and I believe he did. I mean, Satan had a real interest in this situation. I'm sure Satan was watching this situation. Was that for Satan's benefit as well? And I would say that couldn't be. I think it's for our benefit too. I think it's powerfully for our benefit. As we struggle with the existence of evil, pain and suffering, and we say, God, explain it to me completely. We need to go back and read the book of Job. Ron? Right. He did give Job the instruction. I would say he did not give him the answer because he didn't know all the background, but he gave him the instruction. Be faithful to me. And here's why, because I can take care of you. I've done all this. I can take care of you. That's a good point. Well, that was our second bell. So thank you for listening and commenting.